Hello, today I will be presenting to you the domestication of the African pygmy hedgehog, A. albiventris. So first of all, domestication can be defined with four main characteristics. Well, most authors can vary on that, but the most important four are the breeding is controlled by humans. It provides either a service or product that can be useful to humans. It has a docile nature, well, depending on the species, but most of them it's their goal. It's selected away from wild type, and it's reproductively isolated from the wild population. And as you can see, this actually make a new species, which we'll get more on that later. Domestication, there's a syndrome, domestication syndrome. It's when an animal has undergone complete domestication because, of course, we know in order to reach that complete domestication, there has to be some previous generations. I mean, it's not from the first generation on you have a domesticated animal. It has to be throughout some generations. Um, so with this domestication syndrome, what it means physiologically, it's endocrine changes, increased docility, or most of the time, depending on the characteristic you're looking for in the animal. Um, Altered reproduction pattern and output because, for example, wild species may have a reproductive season, whereas for humans we may um, uh, change it to where it can reproduce all year long or it cannot reproduce, so on, so on. Also, altered coat color. This is very specific for some species that are actually more desired towards pet industry for, that sort of thing. They also present floppy ears, facial neoteny. They're usually reduced in size, and there are also slight changes or other changes in body proportions, such as maybe leg length or any other kind. Um, and I really like this statement that one of the papers said that some of them said that one has to consider the animal's set of ecological, behavioral, physiological characteristics and the benefits it may provide to humans in order to completely understand how that animal became domesticated or why it was domesticated or when it was domesticated. These animals actually are some of the ones I mentioned in my work. The first being the horse, which was domesticated around 5.5 thousand years ago, which is recent, you could say. They actually they studied, I think they were 13 horses, sorry. And they discovered that these horses were predecessors to the present horses we now know, but they did see that it had less mutations in their DNA. And of course, they also noticed that because there were a lot of inbreedings, they took a lot of mares, but few stallions. So that actually caused a lot of inbreeding, and that inbreeding caused a lot of neurological diseases. And it had a lot of physiological as well, but the main one was neurological. But it's still a mystery how we got a horse, nowadays. I mean, they are fragile in some things. They do have certain specific things that, it seems they were not completely well domesticated. But at the end of the day, it is an animal that shaped human history because at the end of the day, it helped us transport when there were no cars, and it helped us actually evolve in that sense, you could say. The second was the axolotl, Avistoma mexicanum, because although it's not domesticated in a sense of, oh, we're using it for something, well, something for the general public, it is domesticated in research, one could say, because around the one around the mm, 1,800 years ago, 108,000 years, So approximately 155 years ago. I'm sorry, I don't know how to say the date in English. But they're not domesticated, but there was artificial selection in order because not you could say not a huge population was selected when they were kept for research purposes because it's the animal with the highest known pedigree in research. And of course, for example, the albino morph, you could say, it's not very common in the wild. It would actually be like most species, it's actually a disadvantage because it's more visible towards predators. But while doing the research with the original population, there was inbreeding, but it's actually surprising that there was no significant value to the inbreeding factor. But you could say they were artificially selected to have certain characteristics. For example, the albino, like I mentioned, they were not randomly mated. They were mated specifically in order to keep albino specimens. So it's not completely domesticated, but it was artificially selected for another service. And the other one, the most known one, is the dog, Canis lupus familiaris, which is the first organism, not even the animal, the first organism to be known to be domesticated 15,000 years ago, 14, 15, depending on the author. And there are some fossils regarding the middle stage between what we now know as dogs, which, as you can see in the picture, they are so phenotypically different. You can have a Chihuahua versus a Great Dane versus a Poodle, and they're completely different, but at the same time, they're still the same species. And as I said in my previous presentation with Aldo, they share 98% of the mitochondrial DNA. So it is well known that the wolf, which with whom they share the 98%, I'm sorry about that, um, it is their, you could say, precursor. It's where they were bred from. And it is known that people thought they were coyotes, but they're quite different, if not the same thing. So it is known that the wolf is their ancestor. And with dogs, there is knowledge about when, like, well, not when, because we know it was 15,000 years ago, but how the process started, because it started with wolves getting close to human populations in order to get food. They would be killed because they were a threat, of course, but if any pups were alive, if any live pups went with the wolf, those were kept in order to be tamed and could potentially be used later for hunting or for tracking, so many different things. So there's actually the paleo dog that they know of, which is the first fossil that they have, the first cranium, where you can actually see the distinction between a wolf and a dog. It's not a wolf. It does share some characteristics, but you can see clearly that it's a completely different species. Now onto the African pygmy hedgehog. Actually, African hedgehog. The pygmy is added for when it's a pet. That's usually how it's known in the pet industry. They are insectivores. They're mammals, surprisingly. They weigh 335 grams and approximately and measure 25 centimeters from head to tail. They're distributed throughout Africa from Central and Eastern Africa, as you can see in the map. They have no ventral spines, and actually they have a mechanism, their defense mechanism, as you saw here. Their defense mechanism is to curl up in a ball, and this is using these two muscles. The first one is a muscle that pulls, and the second muscle is the one that keeps the skirt of the loose skin, you could say, that is used to curl up. It keeps it shut tight. And actually, the picture of the hedgehog on the left is actually a defensive hedgehog, not completely defensive, but it is showing how it could defend itself, by pointing the quills. Whereas for example, the one on the right, you can clearly see that the hedgehog is completely The spines are not curled up, so it's um, liso. I'm sorry. They are known. The fossil of these are not known. There are no fossils of this hedgehog, Atelerix albiventris, but for the family Erini, Erinaci, Erinacide, it is known that they have found fossils from the late Cretaceous period. So they are known to be that old. Just there's no fossil of this species. Their reproduction, as you can see in the picture, they're born with quills, but when they're born, it has a membrane and it's soft. Their quills are soft, but after 24 hours, they lose a membrane and the quills harden. These animals have induced ovulation, meaning they ovulate once it's copulating, and they do produce a vaginal plug afterwards. Um, these animals, if disturbed, at least in pet, the pet one, if it's disturbed, it will resort in cannibalism. The father is not, it provides no parental care, whereas the mom is the one that provides all the parental care. And it does hibernate the wild species. This is an European one. It's not the same species, but not known. Like there are no pictures of the species I'm talking about hibernation, but they can reach from 3 to 15 beats per minute when they're hibernating. But it is known to be lethal in pets, which is why it's thought this animal is domesticated, but more on that later. And one of the most interesting things is in the pet industry, there are many specimens that have wobbly syndrome, which is a neurodegenerative disease where as it says, the wobbly, they walk wobbly, they have trouble coordinating, they fall, they can't see very well. It's very important in the animal industry, in the pet industry. And so the research I'm planning to do, or the proposal, this is from a paper, Barrera de Redondo et al. And it shows the steps in order to prove domestication in a species. So you first have to take the samples from the wild and the what you believe is the domesticated species. And then you can do two things. You can either do multiple genomes from various species, and then you would get what is known as a pangenome. And then you sort of see where they overlap, and you can the middle where they overlap is the you could say is the population genomics. It's the reference for the population. Or you could just take from one species and do the whole genome and do a reference. It's called the reference genome. And then afterwards, if you're doing population genomics, which is what I would mostly lean on, you have to do their demographic history, and especially considering that these animals are from Africa and they are now found, well, as pets. They're found everywhere, mostly everywhere except for the places where it's illegal to keep one. So then the analysis would be done, and then at the end of the last step would be to do either in an animal model or a simulation, or that depends on what the cost of what you want it to be. But it's CRISPR-Cas9 in order to validate that the genes you are selecting to be for that specific characteristic, it is what you think it is. And of course, I didn't include the image here, but it's also important for the research to observe the behavior and reproductive patterns on both the pet and the wild, because one of the main problems with domesticated animals in general, species in general, is that they are not separated by, sometimes they are separated by name, like Canis lupus familiaris, or cats, or with bovines, but most of the species, they are not clearly taxonomically named separately from the ancestor, you could say. So I think this is the case here because both pets and wild counterparts are named um, the same, Aterylix adbiventritis, albiventris. So that would have to be checked. That's why I want to actually check this because most people don't know if it's actually a domesticated animal. Some papers say it is domesticated. Some papers say it's still a wild and exotic pet. I mean, most veterinarians treat it as an exotic pet because there are still wild counterparts that phenotypically look the same, but as we saw, some behavioral characteristics are different. For example, hibernation, which is a huge deal in the animal kingdom, especially with animals that it could result in fatalities, like in the pets. It is fatal for a pet to hibernate, whereas in the wild, it's lethal if they don't hibernate. So I think it's important to really understand if these animals are domesticated and for us to provide a correct welfare and husbandry for these animals. And I think it's very important to know. And these are my references. Thank you very much.